Dex Lightning versus Faith Lightning. The age-old question, which one is a better lightning build, Dexterity or Faith? As many veteran players may know, Lightning was split between Dex and Faith rather than being a Faith exclusive like it was in previous titles. While both of these are incredibly powerful and viable options, they don't build too well into each other. So let's say you want to build a Lightning build, which one is better? Well, to determine this, we're going to need to look at 5 categories: accessibility, shared abilities, unique abilities, damage, and level investment. And as a heads up, some concepts that I'm going to go over that I'm calling Dex may fall into the category of quality, such as a Dragon Halberd and the Stormhawk Axe. Now, talking about the 5 categories, I'm not going to necessarily put a X or Y wins in any specific category because it kind of removes the context. Alright, now let's talk about similar abilities, specifically Lightning Slash versus Electrify Armament, Hone Bolt versus Thunderbolt, and Lightning Spear versus Ancient Lightning Spear. As a heads up, I'm going to be using a level 80 Erdtree Seal for these numbers, with the Incant Boost Talismans, with also the Gravelstone Seal and the Offhand. And we're going to compare it on Dex weapons on Keen max upgrade, with and without the Shard of Alexander. Start off without. First, start off with the Dex equivalents with the Bolted Grandsax's Ancient Lightning Spear, which is about 30% lower than Lightning Spear. It does either a total of 1920 without the Shard of Alexander, or 2209 with the Shard of Alexander. The stamina to FP ratio on the Bolted Grandsax and a Lightning Spear are about the same. In general, you're looking at about a 34 to 54% increase in damage, but at a casting speed of 30% slower. Due to the high range, the knockback, and stagger potential of the Bolted Grandsax, it does play better in PvE and within invasions from my experience, but within duels, you might be better off going the Lightning Spear, especially of high dexterity. Now, Thunderbolt and Hone Bolt is where things get interesting. Now, Thunderbolt looks like it is a worse choice overall, but honestly, in this case, it is quite the opposite. Yes, it looks like it has lower damage at a 907 versus a 951, but this is not accurate. Though the casting speed on Thunderbolt appears to be 17% slower, it actually has a much faster recovery speed and a faster initial draw speed. In fact, instead of doing about 5% less damage, it does about 13% additional damage compared to its Hone Bolt variant. Thunderbolt, you could also kind of spam way too long, while for the most part, you're only going to get about 3, 4, if you really have enough stamina, potentially 6 cast of Hone Bolt before you run out, which could put you in a very dangerous situation. So due to the lower stamina cost and the better recovery, Thunderbolt has an objectively higher overall DPS than the spammable nature of Hone Bolt. An example of this is between these two plays. After casting Hone Bolt earlier, it took too long for me to recover from the animation before just getting shredded. But I cast Thunderbolt while she was in midair, and I could honestly just get away from that situation. I got away with something in which in most cases will kill you just because it has a better recovery. But comparison to Hone Bolt, which I used prior to her use her waterfall dance, and I'm guaranteed death. Yeah, there's a difference in how these two things play, and Thunderbolt plays so much better because of that recovery. Hone Bolt really becomes much better when you have a high enough dexterity, high enough endurance, and high enough faith that you can combine them all together. But that's not going to happen until like New Game Plus 2. Now, I promised to show the difference in terms of buffs between, let's say, Electrify Armament and Lightning Slash's buff. But the problem is that just the general Lightning Affinity is going to have a higher damage per its base amount. There are some weapons that are the exception, let's say like the Arumi or the Great Knife or even the Guardian Sword Spear. But in general, typically the Lightning Affinity is going to be much better as an option. And if you put that on Lightning Slash, it can be absolutely brutal and shred through the health of enemies like it is nothing. If you plan on don't use an Ashes of War and plan on using it for more just damage purposes, especially with curved greatswords like the Bandit's curved greatsword, then yes, you're going to want to get the lightning slash on both the banded curved swords and just go in to do a lot of damage. But lightning slash is also really good on things with long range, like this Vihander or like the Nagkiba. But I'm not going to dismiss Electrify Armament, because Electrify Armament is actually really good. If you want to use different incantations, then Electrify Armament does a fantastic job of giving you additional damage that is really good in PvP. Not only that, Electrify Armament is really, really good in terms of allowing for you to use Ashes of War, having a just generally really high AR, while mostly just building faith. I like to use Giant's Hunt when I use Electrify Armament, especially in PvE. In PvP, there's just generally better options. I know you're gonna have somebody saying, aren't you gonna want to put that on a weapon that attacks faster, like the Nagakiba? And yes, you absolutely can. But I love the Giant's Hunt. Not only that, there's just better options and better weapons, like straight swords and colossal swords. Effectively, what I'm getting at is until you get about 60 and 60 in 2 stats, typically lightning is going to overtake Cane plus affinity unless it is a specialized Cane weapon, let's say like the Rumi or like the Guardian Sword Spear. And with those cases, even if you were to add the like lightning buff to it, you're just going to get more better returns from just a lightning affinity. In general, just going that straight dexterity. In the end, in this case, there's no winners, but I do prefer the lightning affinity side of it, just because it does function better and it does allow for a much more viable PvP option for dexterity that feels very, very powerful. Now with these shared abilities, the Faith one does have one other thing up its sleeve, and that's the fact that you could actually use it on Torrent, which actually makes it somewhat better in a very specific way. Now let's go look at something more like unique abilities. Dex has Lightning Ram, 2 forms of Lightning Slash, which I already went over, but Lightning Slash is fantastic for zoning out enemies. As you may see in this clip right here, it just devastates this opponent, and that is only because Lightning Slash is fantastic. Not only that, you also have something like Thunderstorm, which is just absolutely brutal and can mess up and zone out enemies both in PvP, but also Melania, and she has no real answer to this. The biggest downside of a lot of these Dex weapons and affinities is in general they kind of force you to go up in face-to-face with your opponent. Let's say if you're looking at something like Cragblade, you're just shoving yourself into your opponent, but the huge benefit is that when you press a button, you're almost guaranteed to push it all the way through. Compare this to Faith, in which if you're hit by just a sneeze, you're knocked out of the animation. I could build a lot of poise, and yes, I'm still knocked out of the animation, but with Cragblade, you're going to be knocked the enemy out even before you're hit sometimes. It's absolutely ridiculous. The only issue with this weapon, and a lot of these other weapons, is one, the Stormhawk Axe is easily forgotten. Nobody talks about it, despite how powerful it is. But when you look at something like, let's say, the Cragblade, it happens so late in the game. And I believe that goes on to our last part, accessibility. The biggest issue with these lightning dex weapons is that they're very inaccessible. This is where really Faith takes home the cake. When you go a Faith build, you're usually going to be getting all of this stuff by just running a normal playthrough of the game. You can miss pretty much everything outside of the Dragon Claw, which is a very mid weapon, as well as potentially Lightning Slash if you don't got a way to find the lightning stuff. Unless you explore, you're not going to be finding it. Even then, when you explore, the chances of you finding the stuff is pretty slim to none. Like, the Sanctified Blade is literally the only blade in which you cannot, like, you can actually lock yourself out of. Compare this to, let's say, any of the other ones. No, you can find them eventually. In fact, a lot of times if you're to follow a quest, you are going to find them. Like, there are so many grievances about people trying to get the Boulder Grand Sex and realizing they missed it. You have people who just never heard of the Dragon Scale Blade, which is not that great of a weapon, or the Dragon Halberg, in which you have to go out of your way and go in the middle of, let's say, the Scarlet Rod, or in that one very specific part of Sealford River in which nobody has ever seen before. It is absolutely ridiculous. Like, okay, and not only that, to get the Cragblade, a weapon I just talked about, you have to kill Placidusax, and Placidusax is also in a hidden location. Like, pretty much if you were to go Dex Lightning, you have to find the hidden stuff. And that is not too rare for everything, but at least for the Faith's Blasphemous Blade, or for like the Molten stuff, you're at least brought to that part as part of fighting a Shardbearer, fighting Rykard, a very symbolic and important boss in the game, or fighting, let's say, Radahn. Yes, you could get the Bolted thing by going into the Redmane Castle again, but just finding out that you could pretty much jump down in a very specific part of Lindell in order to go and scavenge and eventually find the Sanctified Blade is just, wow, insane. And not only that, you can get locked out. In the end, when you beat the game, Lindell is turned into the City of Ash, so therefore your Thunderbolt is gone, your Bolt of Grandsax is gone, your Sanctified Blade is gone. But when you try to beat the game, normally you are going to be given the options of the Ancient Dragon Lightning spells, and those just kind of pop into your hands. Unless you're going for the Fortisax and Lanciax stuff, you're going to be getting it. Not only that, the deck stuff requires you to upgrade multiple weapons, so while you're restricted in, let's say, spell slots for incantations, for the weapons you can swap out anytime. Like, swapping out weapons, you pretty much just go to your menu and swap them out. You can even swap out mid-combat. I like to do that all the time PvP, but in general, when you look at the cost and the time investment, you're spending about 5 times the amount of time investment and 10 times the cost in order to gain that full access to that Dexterity Lightning. So while the Dexterity Lightning, from what I can see in general, typically will outperform the Faith Lightning, the amount of investment sometimes for a lot of players is not worth it. And even then, swapping out the items instead of just hitting your D-pad or scrolling your mouse bar may not necessarily be worth it for most players. Though I will admit, the Dex Lightning usually is a lot more FP efficient for the damage it does, especially when you look at something like Thunderbolt. In terms of damage to FP efficiency, then yes, Dex Lightning is going to be much more efficient. Especially to reach these cast speed numbers, we had to hit the equivalence of 70 Dex in order to use them, at least in the purposes of testing, to make it fair. Due to either the range or the stamina cost or the FP efficiency, it does make it so the Dex equivalence is much more friendly in terms of level investment. You're going to need lower levels of investment, and you're going to be run out of FP much less, regardless of your choice. This is why when I'm looking at like these cases of, technically I could see Dexterity winning 4 out of 6 of these cases, it really doesn't help it out when you look at the fact that you have to upgrade all these items, all these weapons, and yet you could just play Faith, in which has accessibility to things that are very powerful outside of just lightning. You get pyromancies, you got supportive capabilities, and yes, you do get crafting things in which can allow for Dexterity to allow to compete in this regard in some ways, kind of, but less efficiently. But you're also looking at more grinding and more things that are inaccessible for most players. So if you're a dedicated player and you really want to play a lightning build and you want to run this into PvP, then yes, go ahead and do that. Now, if you're, let's say, over leveling, and yes, I'm talking about an additional 40 plus levels, so if you're like level 168, level 175, level 200, level 225, the Dex Faith builds become really good eventually. But what you're really going to be seeing is, yes, Dexterity Lightning is going to take a lot more time investment if you want that additional versatility. But for individual items or for individual gimmicks, typically I found that Dexterity Lightning is in general much more powerful, at least when it comes to actual practicality. But my biggest recommendation is to play the game however you want. So the numbers in the margins in this that I listed are relatively small. In general, a 10% increase in damage means it's just going to be a 10% change in the fight's tempo. So 10% of a minute is 6 seconds. So if a fight takes 3 minutes, normally on an optimal build, it's going to take 3 minutes and 18 seconds. Just play it how you want to. Play how you enjoy it. Like overall, if you want a better overall lighting build and you want to swap to, let's say, the Bloodhound's Fang later on, then yes, you probably want to look at investing into, let's say, Dexterity and having that be your main stat, and maybe with some strength on the side. Maybe go a quality build with just enough faith in order to buff yourself up with maybe Flame Grabbing Strength, and use, let's say, the Ash of War variant of Golden Vow. But then, let's say if you want to go a, let's say, more Faith build, and you want to go something more like Blasphemous Blade, then you'll build Faith. If you want to have the variety of different spells, especially the higher end spells, then yes, go Faith. It depends on how you want to play the game, but if you're looking for just a strict lighting build, then you're probably going to be better off going Dexterity. Despite what you might see from some of the Ashes of War, the lightning weapons can be just as good, if not much better, especially since the Cragblade is easily underestimated compared to, let's say, lightning strikes, mostly because people are afraid they're going to miss. But if you know how to land it, which is not that hard, then you're going to be pretty much outperforming it. So when you want to ask which one is a better build overall, and yes, I know I have some bias in this regard because of opinions, I do figure out that in general, which one's a better build is up to you. Which one do you like more, and which one fits into your playstyle? I'm gonna actually go ahead and play both. One for the cosplay, and two because I honestly prefer the utility of phase spells, but I do like the dedicated effects of a lot of the Dexterity stuff as well. And honestly, I believe that keeping it separate was not necessarily a good thing, but at the same time, it could also be incredibly overpowered if they were both together. Thank you guys for watching this far in the video. I hope this information was useful. I hope that you guys could kind of get an understanding on where I see both the lightning specializations fitting into the game, with one functioning slightly differently than the other, but in general, they're overall awesome builds. If you guys are not subscribed, please consider doing so. It would be incredibly helpful. Thank you for being awesome, and have an awesome day.